Hello and welcome to another Magic Duels gameplay. Today we're down to the top 4 of the Steam Showdown tournament, where we're up against Spawn Shady. We are playing with our mono red deck, and Spawn Shady is piloting his Jund Sacrifice deck with lots of early blockers and Perilous Mirrors, which will make it difficult for the mono red deck to be victorious in this matchup. In game 1 we're on the play, and we open with a pretty decent opening hand with turn 1 Goblin Glory Chaser, which is pretty likely to get renowned here, since the only way our opponent can interact on turn 1 is by playing a forest and playing Blister Pod, and with only 4 forests and 4 Blister Pods, that's not super likely, but our opponent does have the forest into Blister Pod start, which will invalidate our Goblin Glory Chaser even if we find a removal spell. Instead we find a land, play out our Dragon Fodder number 1, making 2 Goblin tokens, and we're not gonna offer the trade here with the Blister Pod and the Glory Chaser, so we just pause the turn. Our opponent plays a Swamp into a Carrier Thrall, which is yet another creature that can make a Cyan token when he dies, so it's gonna be difficult for the tokens to get in for damage. We draw into a Fiery Impulse, which is also not great against these Cyan generators. So we attack with just the Goblin tokens, hoping our Glory Chaser could still get renowned. Our opponent blocks with the Thrall somehow instead of the Blister Pod, making a Cyan token in the process, get in for 1 point of damage, and play out our second Dragon Fodder, making 2 more Goblin tokens, and keeping up Fiery Impulse, which now has Spell Mastery. Our opponent plays a third land into Nantuko Husk, which is a pretty scary card here, since our opponent can now sacrifice creatures at instant speed to grow the Husk. So end of turn we try to Fiery Impulse the Husk, forcing our opponent to sacrifice a creature on his turn, so the Husk isn't a 4/4 when we try to attack. Our opponent sacrifices the Cyan token. We draw into an Ember Hauler. In hindsight, the correct play here would be to attack with everyone, hoping our opponent would block with the Blister Pod, so that we could use the Firecraft in our second main phase to kill the Nantuko Husk, but instead we care too much about our Glory Chaser and just play out our Ember Hauler, hoping that maybe we could use Ember Hauler plus Firecraft to kill the Husk. But of course, with our opponent playing any creature, that's not gonna work anymore. Our opponent plays Gatecreeper Vine into Perilous Mirror, so now our opponent can sacrifice the Perilous Mirror at instant speed to deal 2 damage to one of our creatures, so that makes this Titan Strength that we've drawn pretty bad, since our opponent can kill our creature that we target in response. We don't have any great attacks, but we decide to attack with all our creatures anyways, hoping our opponent would make a mistake in blocking, since we do have this Titan Strength as a combat trick plus the Ember Hauler. And so here our hopes are that our opponent blocks with the Perilous Mirror, so that our opponent no longer has that instant speed way to deal 2 damage, but our opponent wisely does not block with the Perilous Mirror. We let combat damage happen because we can't really use our Titan Strength, and we have to pause the turn, and now our Titan Strength is going to be pretty bad, since our opponent still has that Perilous Mirror in play. Our opponent plays Elvish Visionary, drawing a card, and also plays a second Perilous Mirror, so now our opponent has 2 instant speed ways to deal 2 damage, and there's no way that we can kill the Husk now, since the only way we can kill the Husk is by dealing damage to it, and our opponent has lots of creatures to sacrifice. We draw into a second Ember Hauler, so maybe we can draw enough burn to just burn our opponent out. We have 4 burn in play with the 2 Ember Haulers, plus 4 damage with Exquisite Firecraft. And thinking about our outs, we do still have Avaricious Dragon and Akoum Firebird that could fly over to deal some damage, but the problem is that our opponent still has these 2 Perilous Mirrors, which could kill those flyers. So first we need to force our opponent to use one of those mirrors, so that our potential flyers that we can top deck won't die to the Perilous Mirrors. So we play out this Infectious Bloodlust on one of our tokens, so that our opponent uses one of the mirrors to kill the token in response, so that we don't get a second copy of the Infectious Bloodlust. The first leap activation finds our opponent a second copy of Nantuko Husk, and the second leap activation end of turn finds our opponent yet another copy of Perilous Mirror, which means another Perilous Mirror we have to take care of before trying to resolve one of our flyers. Act of Treason on one of our Ember Haulers means we sacrifice it in response to deal 2 damage to our opponent, who is now at 14. Our opponent will play out the Perilous Mirror and can now attack with Nantuko Husk, which we don't have any great blocks for, but we also don't die with this attack, so we just take 2, go down to 18, we untap and draw into another copy of Dragon Fodder. We can actually attack with our Goblin token since our opponent only left 1 toughness creatures on defense. Our opponent offers a trade with the Visionary. We can't really use the Titan Strength because otherwise our opponent could just use the Leap to sacrifice the Visionary instead of having to use the Perilous Mirror. We play out our copy of Dragon Fodder. Opponent plays Evolving Wilds, getting a land, and then plays out the second copy of Nantuko Husk that we knew about. And then the first Nantuko Husk can attack. We still don't have to block it, so we just take 2 since we're not dead on board if our opponent goes all in. And we get to untap, find another copy of Exquisite Firecraft, so now we have 8 points of burn in hand plus 2 in play. We use one of the Firecrafts to spend our mana. Opponent goes down to 10, and end of turn they decide to use Evolutionary Leap on one of the Perilous Mirrors to deal 2 damage to the Ember Hauler, which we can sacrifice in response to deal 2 damage to our opponent, who is now at 8. And the Leap reveals a Nissa, so our opponent could play Nissa next turn and Transformer right away, which is what our opponent does here. Plays Nissa, finds a forest, plays out the forest and transforms Nissa. Then Nissa's +1 reveals Elvish Visionary, but before playing the Visionary our opponent plays out Shadows of the Past, which here can give our opponent a bunch of scries, but more importantly our opponent can start gaining 2 life every turn or even 4 life every turn and drain us for 2 or 4 as well. So now our burn plan is kind of dead, and the only hope is if we find one of our flyers so that we can deal consistent damage every turn. We untap and find another copy of Titan Strength, which is bad. We decide to use the Exquisite Firecraft on the Nissa to take care of it so our opponent doesn't draw too many cards, since we can't burn our opponent out with the shadows in play. Our opponent plays Elvish Visionary, draws another card, plays a land, and goes to combat with the Nantuko Husk and the Scion token. We take 3 down to 13. End of turn we use Titan Strength just for the Scry 1 on the Nantuko Husk. Our opponent could sacrifice it in response to deny the Scry 1, but does not. And we scry Mage-Ring Bully to the bottom and draw into Avaricious Dragon, which is exactly the card we needed here to still have a shot. Our opponent uses the Shadows of the Past end of turn to drain for 2. Untaps and has the answer for the Avaricious Dragon in Ob Nixilis, minuses Ob Nixilis to kill the dragon, gets another scry on the Shadows, uses the Shadows to drain for 2, and sees the win on board here. Our opponent can sacrifice everything to the Nantuko Husk, deal damage with the Perilous Mirror, and the Nantuko Husk will be an 8/8 and will be at 7 life, so the Nantuko Husk can attack, and Junt Sacrifice takes game 1 over Mono-Red. In game 2 we are on the play once again, and we have an opening hand with 4 lands, which is a bit much, and it's also missing some non-creature spells to enable prowess, so we decide to mulligan into a pretty good second hand here, since we have yet again turn 1 Goblin Glory Chaser. So again we have to hope our opponent doesn't play Forest into Blizzardpod to try and block the Glory Chaser, and this time our opponent does not have the Forest and instead plays out a Woodland Cemetery tapped, so that's good news for the Glory Chaser, which can finally become renowned. So we attack for 1, put the opponent down to 19, and the Glory Chaser becomes renowned and now has Menace, so it's going to be difficult for the opponent to block our Glory Chaser. And here we could play out the Ember Hauler or the Dragon Fodder, and we decide to go for the Dragon Fodder, which is slightly better if our opponent has a Carrier Thrall on turn 2 here. Instead our opponent has Evolving Wilds, which will get a Forest, which comes into play tapped, so our opponent is off to a pretty slow start here without any early blockers. So we get to untap, find a land, so we can attack for 4, put the opponent down to 15. And then in our second main phase we can play out the Ember Hauler and keep up Fiery Impulse and Ember Hauler's activation. Our opponent plays a Rootbound Crag, so has access to all colors but no double black, and has a Perilous Mirror to try to stop the aggression here. We don't have to use anything end of turn. We draw into Infectious Bloodlust, which we can put on our Goblin Glory Chaser, which also has Menace, so we'll get in for 4 points this turn at the very least. So we can attack with everyone. Our opponent decides to block one of our Goblin tokens with the Perilous Mirror, and then tries to redirect the 2 damage to our Ember Hauler, which we can sacrifice to deal 2 damage to our opponent, who is now at 6, with an Exquisite Firecraft in hand, so we just need to find 2 more points of damage somewhere. Our opponent plays Gatecreeper Vine to find a land, finds a swamp, plays a swamp and has a Carrier Thrall to try to stop the bleeding here, but we can use Fiery Impulse on Gatecreeper Vine. So now our Menaced Glory Chaser can go unblocked. And that combined with the Firecraft will be enough to take game 2 here. So Monored ties it up and everything will be decided in the 3rd and final game. For the 3rd time in a row we are on the play and have an opening hand with a Glory Chaser, so that's an easy keep. We also have a Chandra that our opponent will have a hard time answering in the early game, and if she ever transforms she will be able to deal lots of damage to our opponent. So again, turn 1 Mountain into Glory Chaser, hoping our opponent doesn't go Forest into Blister Pod again. There's a Forest and there's a Blister Pod, which makes for a sad Glory Chaser that will have to keep chasing Glory some other day. We find a Firecraft, which combined with Chandra might be able to burn our opponent out, which is why we don't play the Denizen or the Dragon Fodder, because we want to transform Chandra the turn after we play her, so we don't expose her to unnecessary removal, and the only way our opponent can interact with this is if they have Perilous Mirror plus Nantuko Husk. Instead they play Evolving Wilds into a swamp, which means our Chandra is very likely to transform. We quote-unquote untap and find another Firecraft, so that's a lot of damage without having to be involved in combat. Of course we do play out our Chandra here so we can transform her next turn and pass. At this point our creatures will serve as chump blockers to protect our Chandra. 3rd land for the opponent into Nantuko Husk, which is nice but won't be able to stop Chandra from transforming. Twin Bolt is a nice pickup, but now it's finally time to start unleashing Chandra. So she starts out by dealing 1 damage to her opponent. We play out our first spell, which will untap Chandra, so she can deal 1 more damage to her opponent. So now our opponent goes down to 18. And our second red spell for the turn will be Dragon Fodder, making 2 Goblin tokens. This will untap Chandra once again, and now when Chandra deals 1 damage to her opponent, she will transform into her Planeswalker form. Now we also have plenty of blockers to protect our Chandra, and Chandra pluses to deal 2 damage to her opponent, who is now already at 15 without having dealt any combat damage. So we pass it back. Our opponent plays a Carrier Thrall, which is more fuel for the Nantuko Husk, and a Perilous Mirror, which can clear a blocker or deal 2 damage to Chandra's Loyalty. Nantuko Husk attacks Chandra, so we just chump with 1 token, since we don't really want to block with more tokens if we don't have to. So now we get to untap, find an Infectious Bloodlust, which at this point is pretty useless. So we decide to use a Twin Bolt in our main phase. We could have waited until the opponent's turn, but that could backfire if our opponent can clear all blockers and sacrifice those creatures to the Husk on their turn. So we get rid of the mirror, which clears a blocker, and get rid of the Thrall, which makes a Cyan token, and then Chandra pluses to deal 2 more damage to our opponent, who is now at 13. We still have 8 damage in hand. They play out an Evolving Wilds and decide to attack Chandra with not only the Nantuko Husk, but also the Cyan token and the Blister Pod. We decide only to block with a Goblin token on the Nantuko Husk, because we might still be able to sneak in some damage with the Infectious Bloodlust. Opponent fetches with the Evolving Wilds, getting a swamp and passes. and we know our opponent doesn't have any instants we need to worry about. We find a Glory Chaser, so now we can enchant the Glory Chaser with the Bloodlust. Glory Chaser also giving the Denizen +1/+0 until end of turn. Our opponent could sacrifice the Blister Pod to make a Cyan token to block with, but they elect not to. So we attack for 5, putting the opponent down to 8, which is within the range of our 2 Firecrafts. We also still get to +1 on Chandra, dealing 2 damage to our opponent, putting them at 6. So a Chandra activation plus a Firecraft is also enough, but of course Chandra is likely to die here. Our opponent plays Liliana, which is one of the few creatures that could get our opponent out of this, as it's a life-linking creature that could also transform to force us to discard one of the Firecrafts. But if our opponent sacrifices a non-token creature, which our opponent does here with the Blister Pod, Liliana will transform, so our opponent will no longer have a life-linking blocker. Opponent also sacrifices a Cyan token to make the Nantuko Husk into a 6/6, so we'll be able to kill Chandra. And instead of plussing, our opponent elects to minus on Liliana, getting back a Perilous Mirror to try and block our renowned Glory Chaser. We find an Abbot of Keral Keep. We go to combat, our Glory Chaser has to attack, so our opponent can double block it, but all we care about here is protecting our hand from the +2 on Liliana. So the Perilous Mirror will die in combat. And the 2 damage from the Perilous Mirror is redirected to the Denizen, so we don't have any blockers left. We get an Infectious Bloodlust, since a creature with the Bloodlust on it died. We can deal 4 damage to our opponent with Firecraft number 1, and we have plenty of cards we can discard to Liliana's +2. Our opponent plays a land and another Nantuko Husk. They can only deal 6 damage this turn. They let us discard our Bloodlust, and we're still at 20. Nantuko Husk does not attack, and now we can play out our second Firecraft to close out the game. So Monored somehow managed to beat Jund Sacrifice 2 games to 1. So Monored will advance to the finals, where we will be facing the winner of Yondar versus Bo, Monored versus Simic Tempo. But for now, I want to thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this gameplay, and as always, have a nice day.